There is a photograph. You cannot hear it, but you feel its silence. The kind that settles in old rooms where dust moves slower than memory. The kind that makes you hold your breath without knowing why. It sits behind glass now, catalogued and archived, but the glass does nothing to contain what lives inside the frame. Sepia light bleeds across its surface like old varnish, yellowed and cracked at the edges. The paper itself seems to exhale the scent of must and cedar, of parlors long closed and voices long stilled. When you look at it, something looks back. The image shows a funeral, 1889. A casket gleams under what must have been candlelight, its lacquered surface catching reflections that should not be there. Around it stand the mourners, 11 figures in black, their faces pale and drawn, their postures rigid in the way of Victorian grief. They are arranged as if for a painting, each one positioned with deliberate care. The floorboards beneath them are dark wood, polished to a mirror sheen. You can almost hear them creak. Behind the assembly, heavy curtains hang motionless, their folds carved into the emulsion like stone drapery. Everything in this photograph speaks of ritual, of tradition, of death observed according to the rules of a world that believed in propriety, even in sorrow. But there is one figure who breaks the pattern. The widow stands at the head of the casket. Her dress is black silk, layered and gathered, the fabric absorbing light as if it were made of absence itself. Her hands are folded at her waist, gloved in lace so delicate you can see the outline of her fingers beneath. A mourning veil cascades from her hat, thick enough to obscure her features completely. It falls past her shoulders, past her chest, pooling slightly where it meets her collar. The veil is not unusual. Widows wore them. They hid tears, preserved dignity, allowed grief to remain private even in public display. But she is too still. Not the stillness of mourning, not the stillness of composure, the stillness of something held in suspension. The other mourners lean slightly, shift their weight, blur at the edges where exposure times caught the tremor of breathing or the unconscious sway of standing too long. Not her. She is a statue, perfectly centered, perfectly vertical. Her head does not tilt, her shoulders do not round. Even through layers of fabric, you sense the rigidity in her spine, the locked joints, the refusal to move that goes beyond discipline. And there is something else. The veil hangs over her face like a curtain, black and dense, but if you stare long enough, you begin to see through it. Not completely, just suggestions, the faint outline of a nose, the shadow where a mouth might be, and the eyes. Even through the veil, they seem open, not closed in grief or exhaustion or prayer, open, staring forward, staring at the camera, staring at you. The photograph was taken by a man named Keene, a traveling portraitist who specialized in post-mortem work, in capturing the last moments of the dead for families who could not afford to remember any other way. He used glass plate negatives, long exposures, careful staging. His work was methodical, professional, unremarkable in every way except one. This photograph, the one he took in Ash Grove, Alabama in the autumn of 1889, the one that sat in his collection for decades, unremarked upon until someone finally looked closer. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and please subscribe and like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and let the story unfold. The widow in the photograph never blinked, not once during the 8-minute exposure. Assistants who were present recalled it later, in whispers, in fragments. They said the air in the room felt heavy. They said the candles burned without flickering. They said when Keene checked the focus through the lens, he paused, stepped back, checked again. One assistant claimed he heard Keene mutter something about condensation, about fog forming inside the camera, but that was impossible. The room was cold. When the plate was developed, it came out darker than expected. the shadows too long, the mourners' faces almost spectral in their pallor, and the widow, still as stone, still as death, stood at the center of it all with her veil hanging like a shroud. And when the image was enhanced, everything changed. Ash Grove, Alabama, was not a place where history happened. It was a place where history repeated. The same families married into the same families. The same fields were planted each spring. The same hymns were sung each Sunday in the white clapboard church that stood at the crossroads like a sentinel. It was a town of red clay and pine forests, of summer heat that pressed down like a hand and winters that came sharp and brief. People were born there, people died there, and in between they lived lives that rarely traveled beyond the county line. In 1889, Ash Grove had a population of just under 300 souls. Most of them worked the land or worked for those who owned it. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a mill by the creek that ground corn into meal. There was the church, of course, and there was Dr. Whitcomb, who tended to the sick and injured with the quiet competence of a man who had seen too much suffering to be surprised by any of it. His wife was Eleanor. She had been Eleanor Marsh before the wedding, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, raised to read Latin and embroider pillowcases and conduct herself with the kind of grace that rural towns called breeding. She was not beautiful in the way of storybooks. Her features were sharp, angular, her eyes a pale gray that seemed to see through rather than at. But she was composed, always composed. She moved through rooms like water, silent and inevitable. When she spoke, people listened. When she smiled, it was brief and precise, like the closing of a latch. She married Dr. Whitcomb in 1883. It was considered a good match. He was older by 15 years, established, respected. She brought education and refinement to a household that had been bachelor bare for too long. They lived in a 2-story house at the edge of town, painted white with green shutters, surrounded by magnolia trees that bloomed in late spring and filled the air with a scent so heavy it felt like drowning. The house had a parlor with a piano. Eleanor played it sometimes, hymns mostly, her fingers precise on the keys. They had no children. The town whispered about that, whispered about the separate bedrooms, whispered about the doctor's long hours and the way Eleanor walked to the cemetery every Sunday after service, alone, to place flowers on graves that were not her family's. But they were whispers, nothing more. In Ash Grove, you did not pry into the lives of those who stood above you in station. Then came the autumn of 1889. The doctor died on a Thursday. The circumstances were unclear, confused, contradictory depending on who told the story. Some said it was a fall from his horse on the road, home from a late-night call. Others said he had taken ill suddenly, a fever that burned through him in less than a day. A few, the ones who drank at the tavern and spoke too loudly, said he had drowned in the creek, though no one could explain what he had been doing there in the middle of the night. His body was found at dawn, cold and stiff, his medical bag still clutched in one hand. Eleanor did not cry, not when they brought him home, not when they laid him out in the parlor, not when the pastor came to offer condolences and scripture. She stood by the window and looked out at the magnolias, her face as still as carved wax. The neighbors brought food. She thanked them politely and did not eat. They offered to sit with her. She declined. She was, they said later, perfectly composed. The funeral was delayed, 3 days, then 4, then 5. The heat that autumn lingered unseasonable and oppressive, and people began to worry about the body. But Eleanor insisted. She wanted the arrangements to be proper. She wanted the photograph. That was when Mr. Keene arrived. He came on the train from Montgomery, carrying his camera and tripod and cases of glass plates wrapped in velvet. He had been summoned by telegram. Funeral photography was part of his trade, though not the part he spoke of in polite company. He set up in the parlor where the casket had been placed, the one with the piano and the heavy curtains that could be drawn to control the light. He arranged the mourners with the practiced eye of a man who understood composition. Sisters, neighbors, the pastor, 11 people in all, dressed in black, positioned around the casket like petals around a center, and Eleanor at the head, veiled, silent, still. The exposure took 8 minutes. Keene timed it, with his pocket watch, counting the seconds under his breath. 8 minutes of absolute stillness. 8 minutes of holding breath and locking knees and staring into the lens. People fainted during such sessions. Children cried. Mourners swayed and had to be steadied. It was an ordeal, a test of will and endurance. Eleanor never moved, not once. Her hands remained folded, her head remained level, her eyes, visible only as shadows beneath the veil, remained open. One of Keene's assistants, a young man named Thomas who helped with the plates and the lights, said later that he felt sick halfway through the exposure, a pressure in his chest, a ringing in his ears. He wanted to leave but did not dare move. He said the room smelled wrong. Not like death, he had been to enough funerals to know that smell, like something else, like metal, like ozone before a storm. When the shutter finally closed, everyone exhaled. The spell broke. The mourners shuffled, stretched, whispered among themselves. Eleanor remained motionless for another moment, then turned and walked upstairs without a word. Keene developed the plate that night in his makeshift darkroom at the boarding house. When the image emerged from the chemicals, he stared at it for a long time. Then he packed it away and left Ashgrove the next morning. He never spoke of the photograph again. And yet, no one noticed her eyes were never closed. The stories about how Dr. Whitcomb died were like water running through fingers. You could not hold them. You could not make them stay still long enough to examine. Each person who spoke of it remembered something different, emphasized something else, left gaps where details should have been. It was as if the event itself had fractured, splintered into a dozen partial truths that would never coalesce into one solid narrative. The drowning theory came from the miller, who swore he saw the doctor's horse hitched near the creek in the hours before dawn. The water there ran shallow most of the year, barely deep enough to cover a man's boots, but after rain it could swell and darken and pull at anything that broke the surface. There had been rain that week. The doctor's coat was soaked when they found him. His hair smelled of river silt, but his lungs held no water. The coroner, a retired physician from the next county, noted that in his report. Drowned men have water in their lungs. The doctor did not. Others insisted it was a fall. The road between Ashgrove and the outlying farms was rutted and uneven, especially at night. A horse could stumble, a rider could be thrown, head strikes stone, neck breaks clean. It happened. It had happened before. But the doctor's body showed no bruising consistent with a fall, no broken bones, no marks, except a single pale ring around his left wrist, as if something had gripped him there, tightly, for a long time. And then there was the poison theory, whispered mostly, never said outright. The doctor kept medicines in his bag, tinctures and compounds, things that could heal or harm depending on dose. Arsenic for tonics, laudanum for pain, mercury for syphilis. Perhaps he had taken something by mistake. Perhaps he had taken something on purpose. Men carried burdens the town never saw. But the coroner found no chemical residue in his stomach, no burns in his throat, no scent of almonds or bitter herbs. What they did find was this: his body temperature was far too low for the time of death. His wedding ring was still warm when they removed it, but his skin was cold as clay. His eyes were open, staring, pupils dilated so wide there was almost no gray left at all. And his right hand, the one not clutching the medical bag, was clenched in a fist so tight they had to break the fingers to open it. Inside was a lock of hair, dark brown, tied with a black ribbon. Eleanor did not identify it. When asked, she simply said it was not hers. The days between the death and the funeral stretched like taffy, thin and elastic and somehow wrong. Autumn in Alabama should have been cooling by then, but the heat pressed down relentless and damp. The magnolias around the Whitcomb house dropped their leaves early, littering the ground with brown curled shapes that looked like hands. Eleanor did not leave the house. Neighbors who came to call found her in the parlor, standing by the casket, one hand resting on the polished wood. She was always standing, never sitting, never weeping, just standing there in the half-light, her mourning dress blending into the shadows until she seemed part of the room itself. One neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, said Eleanor's eyes looked different, paler, almost colorless like glass. Another, Mr. Harding, said he saw her lips moving as if in prayer, but when he leaned closer, he heard no words, just a low hum, a vibration, something that made his teeth ache. The pastor visited daily. He read scripture. He offered comfort. Eleanor listened with her hands folded and her head slightly bowed, the picture of pious grief. But when he finished, she would ask a question, the same question every time. Can the dead return? The pastor explained about resurrection, about Christ, about the promise of eternal life in heaven. That was not what she meant. She asked again, "Can the dead return here?" He told her no, gently, firmly. The dead do not return to this world. That was the nature of death. That was the reason for faith. We let go because we must. We trust they are elsewhere, else when, beyond the veil we cannot cross. Eleanor thanked him. She did not ask again. But later Mrs. Calloway would say she heard Eleanor in the parlor late at night, speaking in a voice too low to make out words, pausing as if listening to answers no one else could hear. When Mr. Keene arrived to take the photograph, the air in the house felt thick. He commented on it to his assistant Thomas, said it was like breathing through wool. Thomas, who had been to dozens of wakes and funerals, said it was just the heat, just the closed windows, just the smell of flowers and grief. But even he felt it, a pressure, a watchfulness, as if the house itself had turned its attention inward. They set up the camera in the parlor. Keene was particular about light, about angles, about the placement of every figure. He positioned Eleanor at the head of the casket, her back to the curtained window, her face toward the lens. The veil was her own choice. He had not suggested it. She had come downstairs already wearing it, the black lace falling from her hat in a cascade that erased her features entirely. Keene had photographed veiled widows before. It was common, expected, a symbol of grief and modesty and the separation between the living and the dead. But this veil was different, thicker, almost opaque. When he checked the focus through the viewfinder, he could barely make out the shape of her face beneath it. Just darkness, just the suggestion of a form. He adjusted the lens, adjusted again. The focus would not sharpen. It was as if the veil itself was bending light, swallowing it, refusing to be captured. Thomas prepared the glass plate, coating it with collodion, sensitizing it with silver nitrate. His hands shook slightly. He did not know why. The chemicals smelled sharp and clean, but underneath that, something else, something metallic and wrong. When he slid the plate into the camera, he felt a shock run through his fingers. Static, he thought, just static. Keene instructed the mourners to remain still, to breathe shallowly, to fix their eyes on a point beyond the camera. He removed the lens cap. The exposure began. 8 minutes. In that time, Thomas said later, the candles did not flicker once. The curtains did not stir. No one coughed or shifted or made a sound. It was as if the room had been removed from time entirely, placed in a pocket of stillness where nothing could change. He counted the seconds in his head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. By the 3rd minute, his chest hurt. By the 5th, he felt dizzy. He wanted to look away from the widow, but could not. Even though the veil hid her face, he felt certain she was staring directly at him. At 6 minutes, he thought he saw her veil move, not a flutter or sway, a tightening, as if something beneath it had shifted, pressed forward. He blinked. The veil was still. At 7 minutes, one of the mourners, an older woman, a sister of the doctor, began to cry silently. Tears ran down her face, but she made no sound. Her shoulders did not shake. The tears simply fell, as if her body had decided to weep without her permission. At 8 minutes, Keene replaced the lens cap. The exposure was complete. Everyone exhaled at once. The spell shattered. People stumbled, caught themselves, murmured apologies. The older woman collapsed into a chair and sobbed audibly now, great heaving gasps. The pastor moved to comfort her. Eleanor did not move. She stood there, veiled and still, for another 30 seconds. Then she turned, smoothly, as if on a pivot, and walked upstairs. No one followed her. No one spoke to her. Thomas carried the exposed plate back to the boarding house with shaking hands. Keene developed it alone that night, in the red glow of the safety lamp, watching the image emerge from the chemical bath like something rising from deep water. When it was fixed and washed and dried, he held it up to the light, and there it was, the mourners pale and solemn, the casket gleaming, the curtains, the floor, the careful composition, everything as it should be, except the widow. She stood at the center of the frame, veiled and dark, but something about her was wrong. The shadows around her were too deep. The space she occupied seemed to pull the eye, to drag at the edges of perception, and her face beneath the veil, though still hidden, gave the impression of being visible, of being seen. Keene packed the plate carefully. He left Ashgrove the next morning without saying goodbye to anyone. He would develop hundreds more photographs in his career, document hundreds more deaths, but he never looked at that plate again. He filed it away in a wooden case marked only with a date and a location, and when he died in 1912, his collection was sold to a museum in Montgomery. The plate went with it, uncatalogued and unremarked. It would be almost a century before anyone looked closely enough to see the truth. When they finally developed the plate, the widow was smiling. The photograph should not have survived. Glass plate negatives are fragile, prone to cracking, to separation of the emulsion, to the slow decay that claims all physical memory. They must be stored flat in controlled temperatures, away from light and moisture and the careless handling of time. Most do not last. Most are thrown away, broken, lost to fire or flood or simple indifference. History is not preserved. It is abandoned and occasionally, accidentally, recovered. The Keene collection arrived at the Montgomery Historical Archives in 1913, a year after the photographer's death. 73 plates in total, each wrapped in brown paper and labeled in Keene's meticulous handwriting. Portraits mostly, a few landscapes, several post-mortem studies which were set aside and stored in a separate vault because such images made donors uncomfortable. The collection was catalogued briefly, names, dates, locations, and then filed away. No one examined the plates themselves. No one held them up to the light. They were simply inventory, records of a trade that had already become obsolete, replaced by faster films and simpler cameras. For 84 years, they sat in darkness. Then came digitization, the push to preserve, to archive, to make the past accessible to a present that consumed images faster than it could create meaning. In 1997, a graduate assistant named Sarah Chen was hired to scan the Historical Archive's photograph collection, plate by plate, negative by negative, converting analog memory into digital permanence. It was tedious work. Most of the images were unremarkable: stiff families, unsmiling children, storefronts long demolished. She scanned them anyway, 8 hours a day, 40 plates a week. She found the Ash Grove funeral photograph on a Tuesday in March. The plate was in better condition than most, the emulsion still intact, the glass uncracked. The label read, "Whitcomb Funeral, Ash Grove, Alabama, November 1889. She placed it on the light table, positioned the scanner, began the capture. The preview image appeared on her computer screen. A standard post-mortem portrait, mourners around a casket, a veiled widow at the center, nothing unusual. She adjusted the scan settings, higher resolution, deeper bit depth, and ran it again. This time she paused. There was something about the widow's veil, a density to it that seemed inconsistent with the rest of the image. Sarah had scanned hundreds of Victorian photographs by then. She knew the way fabric rendered in collodion emulsion, translucent, gauzy, with a soft gradient where light passed through. This veil was different. Opaque in some areas, almost transparent in others. She zoomed in, enhanced the contrast, sharpened the details. And then she saw the face, not hidden, not obscured, visible, pale as bone, eyes open and black, mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile but suggested one. The veil had not hidden the widow's features, it had preserved them, captured them in a way the rest of the photograph had not. While the mourners around her blurred slightly at the edges, caught in the minor movements of an 8-minute exposure, her face was sharp, perfectly focused, perfectly still, as if she had not been part of the same moment as everyone else. Sarah printed the enhanced image, stared at it, printed it again with different settings. The face remained. She checked the original plate under magnification. There, embedded in the emulsion itself, were the same details. This was not a digital artifact, not a scanning error. The face had been there all along, waiting beneath the veil for technology capable of seeing it. But that was not the strangest part. The eyes. When Sarah enlarged them, increased the contrast, adjusted the curves, she saw something reflected in the black pupils. Shapes, figures. She inverted the image, applied various filters, tried to clarify what she was seeing. It took 3 days and a dozen different techniques before the reflection resolved into something recognizable. Faces, human faces, 11 of them, arranged in a group, staring forward. The same faces that appeared in the photograph as mourners, but reversed, as if seen from the other side of the camera, as if the widow's eyes had captured not what was in front of her, but what was behind the lens. The people who were watching, the people who were witnessing, the people who thought they were safe on the other side of the camera's gaze. Sarah ran the reflection through enhancement software designed for forensic photography. The faces sharpened. She could make out details now, the shape of a nose, the line of a jaw, the texture of hair. She compared them to the mourners in the main image. They matched, person for person, feature for feature. But the expressions were different. In the main photograph, the mourners looked solemn, composed, performing grief for the camera. In the reflection, they looked afraid. She published her findings in a small academic journal, a footnote in the history of photographic anomalies. The article included the enhanced images, the technical analysis, the comparison between the reflection and the mourners. She noted that such reflections were theoretically impossible. Pupils do not reflect with that kind of clarity, and the angle of the light in the room would not have produced that specific image. She concluded that it was likely a double exposure, an accidental overlap of 2 plates, a mistake in Keen's developing process. But she did not believe that. She wrote it because she had to write something, because academic papers require conclusions. because saying "I do not know what this is" would have ended her career. The article was largely ignored. Then, 6 years later, someone posted the enhanced image to a forum dedicated to historical mysteries. It spread, slowly at first, then faster. Pinterest, Tumblr, Reddit. The image acquired a name: The Widow Who Never Blinked. People began to investigate. They tracked down the location, Ashgrove, Alabama. They searched for death records, census data, newspaper archives. They found the names of the mourners, all 11 of them, and they found something else. Every person in that photograph, every person whose face appeared reflected in the widow's eyes, had died within a year of the funeral. The pastor, heart attack, January 1890. The older sister, stroke, March 1890. The neighbor, accident with farm equipment, June 1890. The blacksmith, fever, August 1890. One by one, through the 12 months following that November funeral, they died. Different causes, different circumstances, but all of them gone. All of them mourners at Dr. Whitcomb's funeral. All of them staring into Eleanor's eyes. Only Eleanor survived. She lived until 1928, dying at the age of 71 in the same house where her husband had been waked. Alone, unmourned. The house was sold, emptied, eventually demolished. No one kept records of what they found inside. No one asked questions. By then, Ashgrove itself was dying, the population drifting away, the fields going fallow, the church closing its doors. The town exists now only as a name on old maps, a scattering of ruins in pine forest, a place where history happened once and was forgotten. But the photograph remains, and now enhanced and circulated, examined by thousands of eyes. It carries a question that no amount of analysis can answer. Was Eleanor a victim of grief, her face frozen by the shock of loss? Or was she something else? Something waiting behind the veil, something that looked out through the camera lens and marked those who looked back. By the end of that year, not one of them remained alive. I first saw the photograph in December of 2019, not the original plate that remains in the Montgomery archives, handled only by archivists in gloves under controlled conditions, but a high-resolution scan posted to a website dedicated to unexplained historical images. The site was poorly designed, cluttered with advertisements and dubious theories, but the photograph itself was striking enough to warrant deeper investigation. I am a documentarian by trade, specializing in 19th-century American funerary practices, and I have seen thousands of post-mortem portraits. This one was different. I contacted the archives. They sent me the full technical analysis, Sarah Chen's original article, and permission to examine the plate in person. I drove to Montgomery in January of 2020, arriving on a morning cold enough that my breath fogged the windshield. The archives building was old brick, institutional, the kind of structure that houses memory without celebrating it. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust and the faint chemical tang of preservation. The archivist brought the plate to me in a viewing room, placed it on a light table, stepped back. I looked at it for a long time. Even without digital enhancement, even with the naked eye, there was something wrong about it. The composition was too perfect, the shadows too deep, and the widow, veiled, central, still, seemed to occupy more space than her physical form should allow. I photographed the plate with a high-resolution camera. I took notes. I asked about provenance. The archivist told me what little was known. Keene's collection, purchased from his estate, stored since 1913. No other information existed. I asked if I could visit Ashgrove. The archivist laughed, said there was no Ashgrove anymore. Not really. Just ruins, old foundations, a cemetery no one tended. I went anyway. The drive took 2 hours south and east, through farmland and pine forest, down roads that narrowed from highway to 2-lane to gravel. I passed towns that were barely towns, a gas station, a church, a cluster of trailers. Ash Grove, when I found it, was not marked. No sign, no historical plaque, just a gap in the trees where a road used to be. I parked and walked. The forest had reclaimed most of it. Vines grew over foundations. Saplings pushed through floorboards. I found the remains of the church first. White clapboards grayed by weather. The steeple collapsed, the door hanging open on broken hinges. Inside, pews rotted into mulch. Hymnals dissolved into pulp. A single stained glass window remained intact, cracked but whole, depicting a lamb and a shepherd. Light came, through it in fragments. I found the cemetery behind the church. It was small, enclosed by a rusted iron fence that had fallen in places, overgrown with kudzu and honeysuckle. Most of the headstones were weathered past reading, the inscriptions erased by a century of rain. But I found Dr. Whitcomb's grave near the center, a granite marker taller than the others, engraved with his name and dates. Born 1847, died 1889. Beloved physician, faithful servant. The words were formulaic, generic, the kind of thing families said when they did not know what else to say. Eleanor's grave was next to his, a smaller stone, no inscription beyond her name and dates. Born 1857, died 1928. Nothing about being a beloved wife, nothing about faithfulness, just the facts, just the years. I stood there for a long time, trying to imagine the woman in the photograph as an old woman, dying alone in a house that no longer exists, trying to reconcile the pale, grinning face beneath the veil with the reality of flesh and breath and ordinary time. I could not. The Whitcomb house was a mile outside what remained of the town. I found it by following an overgrown drive that led to a clearing where the foundation still stood, a rectangle of stones, waist-high in some places, crumbled to rubble in others. The magnolias were still there, massive and ancient, their trunks thick as barrels. They would have been young when Eleanor lived here. Saplings. Now they were monuments. I walked the perimeter of the foundation, stepping carefully over shattered bricks and rotted wood. I found fragments of wallpaper, a doorknob green with verdigris, shards of glass that might have been windows or mirrors. In the center of the foundation, where the parlor would have been, the ground was darker. Bare soil, black and compacted, where nothing grew, not even weeds. I knelt and touched it. The earth was cold, colder than it should have been. I dug with my fingers, pulling up clumps of clay, expecting to find stones or roots or some reason for the barrenness. Instead, I found glass. A small piece, no larger than a coin, curved and thin. I brushed the dirt from it, held it up to the light. It was coated on one side with a dark emulsion, cracked and flaking, a fragment of a photographic plate. I wrapped it carefully, put it in my pocket, and left. That night, in a motel 30 miles away, I researched the deaths. Census records, obituaries, church registries. I found all 11 mourners. The pastor died first in January of 1890 of heart failure while preparing a sermon. The older sister died in March, collapsing in her kitchen while baking bread. The blacksmith in June, crushed when a beam in his shop gave way. One by one, through that year, they died. Some from illness, some from accident. One from suicide, a young woman, a cousin of the doctor who walked into the creek and did not come back out. None of the deaths were considered suspicious at the time. They were attributed to natural causes, to misfortune, to the simple fact that death was common in 1890 and life was fragile. But reading them in sequence, one after another, I felt the pattern, felt the weight of it. 11 people, 12 months, all connected by a single photograph, all reflected in a widow's eyes. I returned to the archives the next week. I asked to see Keene's other work, the plates taken before and after Ash Grove. I wanted to know if There were other anomalies, other images that showed things they should not. The archivist brought me boxes of plates. I examined them for hours. Portraits, landscapes, buildings, all normal, all unremarkable. The light behaved as it should. The subjects appeared as they were. There were no hidden faces, no impossible reflections, no suggestions of something watching from behind the emulsion, except one. Near the end of the collection, I found a plate labeled simply, Keen Self-Portrait 1912, the year he died. The image showed him in his studio, elderly and gaunt, standing beside his camera. He was looking at the lens, at himself, at the future that would see this image. His face was drawn, tired, but calm, resigned, and in the background, barely visible, hanging on the wall behind him, was the Ash Grove funeral photograph, framed, displayed, as if it were a prize, as if it were the only image that mattered. I printed that photograph. I hung it on my wall. I looked at it every day for a month, trying to understand what Keene had known, what he had seen through the lens that day in Ash Grove, what he had carried with him for 23 years until his death. And then I realized the reflection did not show me, only them. Forensic photography relies on the principle that cameras do not lie. They record light. They capture what is there. A photograph is evidence, testimony, a witness that cannot be cross-examined or confused or convinced to change its story. When we enhance an image, we are not creating information. We are revealing what was always present, hidden in shadows or grain or the limitations of older technology. This is the foundation of the discipline. This is what makes photographs trustworthy in courts of law, in historical research, in the documentation of truth. The widow's veil should not have been transparent. I commissioned a full technical analysis from a laboratory in Boston that specialized in historical photographic materials. I sent them high-resolution scans of the original plate, along with detailed notes about exposure time, lighting conditions, and the chemical processes Keene would have used. I asked them to explain the transparency of the veil, to explain the visible face beneath it, to explain, most importantly, the reflection in the eyes. The report came back 3 months later, 47 pages of technical analysis, chemical spectroscopy, optical physics. The conclusion was brief. The image shows no evidence of manipulation, double exposure, or chemical contamination. The transparency effect in the veil appears to be the result of differential light absorption in the emulsion layer, though the mechanism by which this occurred is unclear. The reflection in the subject's pupils cannot be explained by any known optical principle. I called the lead analyst, a woman named Dr. Reeves, who had spent 30 years studying 19th century photography. She was careful in her language, precise, unwilling to speculate beyond the data. But when I pressed her, when I asked her directly what she thought had happened, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Light does not behave that way." I asked what she meant. She explained that for a reflection to appear in someone's eyes with that level of clarity, the light source would need to be extremely bright and extremely close. The reflection would also need to be in perfect focus, which meant the pupils themselves would need to be in perfect focus, which they were not. The veil should have created a layer of diffusion that made sharp focus impossible. Furthermore, the angle was wrong. The reflection showed the mourners as if seen from the camera's perspective, looking back at them. But reflections do not work that way. They show what the eye sees, not what sees the eye. Unless, she said, and then stopped. Unless what? I asked. Unless the eyes were not reflecting light from the room. Unless they were reflecting something else, something that was looking through them. She apologized immediately, said she was speaking metaphorically, said she did not mean to suggest anything supernatural or unscientific, but I heard the uncertainty in her voice. The same uncertainty I felt every time I looked at the photograph. The sense that we were examining evidence of something that should not be possible, and yet was. I began searching for similar cases, other photographs that showed impossible reflections, transparent veils, faces that appeared where faces should not be. The field of spirit photography, popular in the late 19th century, was filled with frauds and double exposures, images of ghostly figures imposed over living subjects through deliberate manipulation. But those images looked fake. Obvious. The superimposed spirits were always translucent, always poorly integrated, always slightly out of focus compared to the rest of the photograph. The Ash Grove image was different, seamless, integrated, real. I found one other case, a daguerreotype from 1852, taken in Charleston, South Carolina, a portrait of a young woman in mourning dress, standing beside a cradle. The cradle appeared empty in the original image, but when the plate was scanned and enhanced in 2015, an infant became visible, pale, eyes open, lying perfectly still. The woman in the photograph had lost a child 3 weeks before the portrait was taken. The photographer's notes mentioned nothing unusual. The family never commented on the image. The infant remained invisible for more than 160 years, until technology advanced enough to see it. The cases were not identical, but they shared something, a quality, a sense that the photograph had captured more than the photographer intended, more than the subjects knew, as if grief itself had weight, as if loss could imprint on silver nitrate the way light does. I returned to Eleanor's story, to the fragments of her life that remained in public records. She was born Eleanor Marsh in 1857, the third daughter of a schoolteacher. She married Dr. Whitcomb in 1883. They had no children. In 1889, her husband died. In the decades that followed, she lived alone in the house on the edge of Ash Grove, leaving only for church and supplies. Neighbors described her as distant, silent, unchanging. One account from 1903 mentioned that she still wore black, still kept the parlor arranged as it had been for the funeral, still played the piano, always the same hymn. I found her death certificate, cause of death, cardiac arrest. She was found in the parlor, seated at the piano, her hands resting on the keys. The doctor who signed the certificate, not her husband, he had been dead for 39 years, noted that her body was cold when discovered, suggesting she had been dead for several hours. But he also noted something unusual. Her eyes were open, and she was smiling. I tried to find Eleanor's diary, her letters, any personal writing that might explain what she had felt, what she had believed, what she had done in the days and weeks after her husband's death. I searched archives, historical societies, the records of the demolished house. Nothing survived, or nothing was kept. The only words attributed to Eleanor came from the pastor's notes, recorded during his visits after the funeral. One entry, dated November 12, 1889, 3 days after the photograph was taken. Mrs. Whitcomb asked again about resurrection. I explained the doctrine. She said she did not want heaven, she wanted him here. Another entry, dated November 19. Mrs. Whitcomb has stopped eating. She sits in the parlor and stares at the wall where the photograph will hang. She says she is waiting. A final entry, dated December 1st. I can no longer visit Mrs. Whitcomb. The house feels wrong. She does not seem to hear me when I speak. Her eyes follow me but do not see me. I fear for her soul. The pastor died 3 weeks later. I tried to understand it, tried to find a rational explanation that fit the facts. Grief could do terrible things to a mind. It could warp perception, create hallucinations, drive people to self-destruction. Perhaps Eleanor had suffered a psychological break after her husband's death. Perhaps the photograph captured her at the moment of fracture, when the person she had been dissolved and something else, some broken, desperate version of herself, took its place. Perhaps the mourners who died were simply victims of coincidence, their deaths unrelated to the funeral or the photograph or the widow's staring eyes. Perhaps. But I did not believe it, because I had seen the fragment of glass I found at the foundation. I had brought it to a conservator, had it analyzed. It was photographic plate glass from the 1880s, coated with a collodion emulsion that contained silver nitrate. But the emulsion also contained something else, something that should not have been there. Blood. Human blood. Mixed into the chemical layer. The conservator said it was impossible. No photographer would contaminate emulsion that way. It would ruin the image, introduce impurities, create unpredictable reactions. But the tests were definitive. The blood was there, old blood, degraded, but still identifiable. I asked if they could determine whose blood it was. They said no, the sample was too small, too degraded. DNA testing was impossible, but they could tell me when the blood was added. The chemical analysis showed that the blood had been mixed into the emulsion before the plate was exposed, before the photograph was taken, as if someone, Eleanor perhaps, or Keene himself, had prepared the plate specially, had made it into something more than a tool for capturing light, had made it into a trap. The eyes that never blinked were still waiting. There are letters, not Eleanor's, but letters written by others who saw the photograph. After Keene's death, when his collection was being catalogued, several people requested copies of the Ash Grove funeral portrait. Family members, descendants of the mourners, people who wanted to remember those who had died. The archives have records of these requests and, in some cases, copies of letters that accompanied them. One letter, dated 1914, from a woman named Catherine Harding, granddaughter of one of the mourners. I am writing to request a copy of the funeral photograph taken at the Whitcomb service in 1889. My grandmother appears in the image. She died the following spring. I have no other photograph of her. Please send the copy to the address below. I am including payment. The archives sent her the photograph. 3 weeks later, she returned it with a note written in shaky handwriting. Please do not send this photograph to anyone else. There is something wrong with it. I cannot explain what, but when I look at it, I feel as if I am being watched. My sleep has been troubled since it arrived. I see her, the widow in the veil, standing in my room at night. Please burn it. The archives did not burn it. They filed the letter and kept the photograph. Another letter, dated 1931, from a historian researching post-mortem photography. I have examined the Whitcomb funeral portrait extensively. The composition is excellent, the exposure well judged, but there is an unsettling quality to the image that I cannot define. The widow's posture suggests both grief and something else, anticipation perhaps, or satisfaction. I find myself returning to the photograph repeatedly, though it disturbs me. I have ordered an enlargement of the widow's face. I hope magnification will clarify my unease. There is no record of whether he received the enlargement. But 6 months after that letter, he wrote again. Please disregard my previous request. I no longer wish to study this image. I have been ill since the enlargement arrived. Fever, nightmares, a persistent feeling of being observed. My doctor can find no cause. I am returning the photograph and the enlargement. Please remove my name from any future correspondence regarding this collection. A final letter, dated 1983, from a woman who did not give her full name, signing only as M. I saw the photograph in your collection last week during a research visit. I did not request to see it. It was in a box with other plates I was examining for a project on Victorian mourning practices. When I placed it on the light table, I felt immediately cold. The room temperature did not change. I checked, but I felt cold inside, as if something had opened in my chest. I looked at the widow. She looked back. I know that sounds absurd. It is a photograph. It cannot look. But I felt her attention. I felt her recognition. And I understood in that moment that she was not mourning, she was waiting. And she is still waiting. M never returned to the archives. Staff members who were there in 1983 remember her, a young woman, graduate student, nervous and intense. But no one recorded her full name. No one knows what became of her. I tried to find her. I searched university records, contacted history departments, posted inquiries on academic forums. No one responded, or no one knew. M became another absence, another gap in the story, another person who encountered Eleanor's image and then vanished from record. I began having the dreams around that time. They were always the same. I would be standing in the parlor of the Whitcomb house, though I had never seen the interior, only the foundation. The room was dark except for candlelight. The casket was there, closed and gleaming, and Eleanor stood at its head, veiled and motionless. I could not move, could not speak, could only watch as she slowly reached up and lifted the veil from her face. Underneath, she was smiling. Her eyes were open and entirely black, and in the blackness I could see myself, not as I was in the dream, but as I was in waking life, sitting at my desk, looking at the photograph on my computer screen. I was the reflection in her eyes. I was the one being captured. I would wake gasping, my chest tight, my hands numb. The dreams came every night, for 2 weeks. Then they stopped, but the feeling remained. The sense of being watched, of having crossed some threshold by looking too closely, by asking too many questions, by trying to understand what should have remained hidden. I spoke with a colleague, a psychologist who specialized in trauma and obsession. I described the dreams, the photographs, the story of Eleanor and the mourners who died. She listened carefully, then she asked me a question. Do you think you are experiencing a haunting, or do you think you are experiencing the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to disturbing material? I did not know how to answer. I still do not. But I know this. Grief does not dissipate. It does not fade or weaken or lose its shape. It changes form. It becomes memory, ritual, story. It becomes the things we make to hold it, photographs, letters, graves, and sometimes, perhaps, it becomes something more. Something that waits in the emulsion of an old glass plate. Something that looks out through a widow's eyes. Something that recognizes those who look back. The ticking of a clock. The stillness of a room. The weight of a veil. These are not just descriptions. They are sensations, memories embedded in the image itself. Eleanor's memories, her grief frozen in the moment of the exposure, captured along with the light and the faces and the 8-minute silence. She was not smiling in triumph. She was not smiling in madness. She was smiling because she had found a way to keep them, to hold them, to make sure that everyone who mourned her husband would join him, not in heaven, not in rest, but here, in the photograph, in the reflection, in the stillness that never ends. But if memory can outlast death, what happens when the dead remember us? The photograph circulates now, endlessly, across platforms and forums, shared and reposted, captioned and recaptioned, stripped of context and reduced to spectacle. The widow who never blinked, the haunted funeral portrait, the woman who cursed her mourners. It has become viral content, digestible horror, a curiosity to scroll past on the way to other curiosities. Most people who see it do not know the names of the mourners, do not know where Ashgrove was or what happened to it, do not know that Eleanor lived alone for 39 years after the photograph was taken, or that she died smiling at a piano in an empty house. They see only the image, the veil, the pale face beneath it, the black eyes with their impossible reflections, and they scroll on, Museums will not display it. I have asked. I have presented the historical context, the technical analysis, the documented provenance. They decline politely. The reasons vary. Some say it is not significant enough for permanent exhibition. Some say it is too disturbing for general audiences. One curator told me, off the record, that the photograph had been briefly displayed in 1998 as part of a special exhibition on Victorian death customs. It was removed after 3 days because visitors complained. Not that it was offensive, not that it was inappropriate. They complained that it made them uncomfortable, that it followed them, that they could feel it watching. The curator did not believe in hauntings, but he believed in the effect the photograph had on people, and that, he said, was reason enough to keep it in storage. I understand his decision. I have lived with this image for 5 years now. I have studied it, enhanced it, traced its history, documented its effects. I have spoken with archivists and forensic analysts and psychologists and historians. I have driven to Ashgrove twice more, walked the ruins, stood at Eleanor's grave. I have read every letter, every account, every fragment of testimony that remains, and I have come to believe something that I cannot prove, cannot defend in academic language, cannot publish in any journal that would take me seriously. I believe Eleanor succeeded, not in bringing her husband back. Death does not work that way, no matter how desperately we wish it would, but in doing something else, in capturing grief so completely, so absolutely, that it became permanent, not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually permanent, embedded in the photograph like a virus in a cell, waiting for a host. Everyone who looks at the photograph really looks, not a glance but sustained attention, feels something, unease, recognition, the sense of being seen. Some dismiss it, some avoid the image afterward, some, like the mourners in 1889, like Catherine Harding, like the historian who requested the enlargement, like M, experience something more, dreams, illness, the feeling that Eleanor is waiting for them specifically, that she has marked them, that they have joined the reflection in her eyes. I do not know if I am one of them. I still study the photograph, I still write about it, but I no longer keep copies in my home. I look at it only during the day in well-lit rooms, never alone, and I have started to notice something. When I examine the enhanced images on my computer, when I zoom into Eleanor's eyes to study the reflection, the faces there seem to shift, as if new ones are being added, as if the photograph is still capturing, still waiting, still remembering. Perhaps that is paranoia. Perhaps it is the psychological effect my colleague warned me about, the result of staring too long at something disturbing until your mind begins to invent patterns that are not there. Our brains are wired to see faces, to find meaning in randomness, to create stories that make sense of the senseless. This is what humans do. This is how we survive. But photographs are not random. They are deliberate, intentional, created by choices, where to point the camera, when to open the shutter, how long to let the light fall. Keane made those choices in the parlor of the Whitcomb House. In November of 1889, Eleanor made choices too, where to stand, how to hold her body, whether to blink, and somewhere in those 8 minutes of exposure, in the stillness and the candlelight and the grief that filled that room like water filling a well, something was captured that should not have been. Not a ghost, not a curse, but a moment of such concentrated anguish that it bent the rules. That made light behave in ways light does not behave. That turned a photograph into something more than memory, into a door that opens only one way, into a room where time does not pass, where the mourners are always standing and the widow is always watching and the dead are always, always waiting to be joined. The photograph will survive us. Glass plates, when properly stored, can last for centuries. The image will be visible long after everyone alive today is gone, long after our own photographs have degraded into noise and been deleted from servers and forgotten by algorithms. Eleanor's face will remain, her eyes will remain, the reflection will remain, and whoever finds it next, whoever enhances it with technologies we have not yet invented, will see the same thing we see now: a widow at a funeral, a veil, a smile, and faces in her eyes. I think often about what Eleanor wanted. Not resurrection, she said as much to the pastor. She did not want her husband in heaven. She wanted him here, with her, in the world she knew. And when that proved impossible, when death refused to negotiate or bend or make exceptions even for grief as absolute as hers, she found another way. She made a space where the dead could remain, not alive, not at peace, but present, permanent, preserved in light and silver and the attention of everyone who looks. Is that love? Or is it something love becomes when it refuses to let go, when it outlasts reason and health and the natural order of things? I do not know, but I know this. Eleanor died in 1928 at the age of 71, alone in a house that has since been demolished. Her grave is overgrown and forgotten. Her name appears in no history books. The town where she lived has returned to forest. Everything that testified to her existence has crumbled or burned or been erased by time, except the photograph, except the image of her standing veiled at her husband's funeral, staring at the camera, smiling beneath the black lace. That remains. And in remaining, it asks a question, not to archivists or historians or casual scrollers on the internet, but to anyone who has ever loved someone, to anyone who has ever stood at a grave and refused to believe that this is the end, to anyone who has ever wanted time to stop, to reverse, to grant us one more moment with the people we have lost. What would you do to keep them? What would you trade? What would you become? Eleanor answered those questions, and her answer has outlasted her body, her house, her name. Her answer is still visible, still watchable, still waiting in the archives and on screens around the world, not as a warning, not as a ghost story, but as testimony to the fact that grief, when it is deep enough and desperate enough, does not simply fade. It changes, it adapts, it finds forms that can survive. The stillness was never absence. It was her, waiting to be seen. And now you have seen her. Now we all have. And the question that remains is not whether the photograph is haunted. The question is whether we are. Whether by looking we have become part of the reflection, part of the waiting, part of the long, unblinking stare that connects the past to the present, the dead to the living, the woman in the veil, to everyone who stops scrolling long enough to meet her eyes. I do not look anymore. I have written this account. I have documented everything I know. And now I am stepping away, letting the photograph return to archives and algorithms to be discovered and forgotten and rediscovered by others who will have their own theories, their own questions, their own dreams. But before I go, I will tell you one last thing, something I have told no one else. Last week, I received a letter, not an email, an actual letter, handwritten, no return address. The postmark was smudged, unreadable. Inside was a single sentence. She is still adding faces. Below it, a photograph. Not the Ashgrove funeral portrait, but a modern image. Me, standing in front of the Whitcomb Foundation. I remember the moment. I took that photograph myself, a selfie to document my visit. I posted it nowhere, shared it with no one. It exists only on my phone. But here it was, printed on photo paper, placed in an envelope, sent to me by someone I do not know, and in the background, barely visible, standing among the ruins where the parlor used to be, is a figure in black, Veiled, watching. I deleted every image on my phone. I burned the letter. I have not returned to Ashgrove. But sometimes, late at night, I feel cold. The way M described. Cold inside, as if something has opened in my chest. And I wonder if Eleanor has been waiting not just for mourners, but for witnesses. For anyone who looks closely enough to understand what she did, what she became, what she is still doing, frame by frame, exposure by exposure, across the decades and the centuries. This image is a recreation, dramatized for storytelling, but the photograph is real. The widow was real. The mourners died. And Eleanor lived for 39 years after, alone with her grief and her photograph and whatever bargain she made in that dark parlor in 1889. Disclaimer: this story is inspired by historical events and folklore, but not factual. The veil has lifted now. You have seen what lies beneath. And Eleanor, wherever she is, in whatever space exists between emulsion and memory, between light and shadow, between the living and the dead, Eleanor is still smiling.